The various theories of craniofacial growth are based on the expression of intrinsic genetic potential. This video will describe in brief the 4 basic growth theories, depending upon where the growth center is expressed. Genetic theory was put forward by Brodie in 1941. Brodie stated that the persistent pattern of facial configuration is under tight genetic control. Genes determine the overall growth control. This theory is more of an assumption and is not proved. Primary genetic control determines only certain features and does not have complete influence on growth. Sutural theory was put forward by Zischer. Zischer said that bone growth within various craniofacial units is the result of growth taking place in sutures. The growth of the skull tissue is controlled by its own genetic potential. All bone-forming elements like cartilage, sutures, and periosteum are growth centers, according to Zischer. But this theory is also called a sutural dominance theory, because proliferation of connective tissue, and its replacement by bone in the suture, is considered to be the primary event. Growth in the sutures, which attach maxillary complex to the cranium, drives the midface down. Suture is a tension-adapted tissue, and any unusual pressure on suture initiates bone resorption, and not bone deposition, which contributes as a drawback of this theory. On other hand, the sutures lack intrinsic genetic growth. Extirpation or removal of facial sutures have no effect on the growth of skeleton. Shape of the sutures varies, depending upon the functional needs. Differences in development of skull, in microcephaly, and hydrocephaly, are not in accordance with the size of the sutures. So to conclude, sutures do not act as primary growth center. Growth in the sutural area is secondary, in response to functional needs. Evidence in favor of secondary role of sutural growth is more. Nasal septal cartilaginous theory was put forward by Scott. This theory is based on the principle that cartilage is a pressure-adapted tissue, and growth of cartilage in nasal septum provides force that displaces maxilla downwards and forwards. Scott said that intrinsic growth potential is present in cartilage and periosteum. Hence, cartilage and periosteum are growth centers. Nasal septum is the major contributor in maxillary growth. Sutural growth is passive and secondary to cartilaginous growth. In mandible, condylar cartilage is considered to be the growth center, present bilaterally with the U-shaped mandible in between. Based on experimental evidences, extirpation of septal cartilage in rats and rabbits resulted in deficient snout of these animals. In nasal septum and cranial synchondroses, endochondral ossification is present. Transplantation of epiphyseal plate and synchondroses results in growth in the transplanted area. This led to the conclusion that epiphyseal cartilages and cranial synchondroses can act as independent growth centers. Nasal septum acts as center, to a limited extent. Condylar cartilage growth is secondary, and not primary. The functional matrix theory claims that the origin, growth, form, position and maintenance of all skeletal tissues and organs are always secondary, compensatory and obligatory responses to temporally and operationally prior events or processes that occur in specifically related non-skeletal tissues, organs, or functioning spaces. Functional matrix hypothesis was put forward by Melvin Moss. It is based on the work of van der Klauwe. Simply, the theory states, there is no direct genetic influence on the size, shape, or position of skeletal tissues, only the initiation of ossification. All skeletogenic activities are primarily upon the functional matrices. According to Moss, head is a structure which carries out many functions, like respiration, neural integration, digestion, hearing function, etc. Each one function is carried out by tissues and spaces in the head. The tissues and spaces together, which are responsible for a single function, are called functional cranial component. Functional cranial component is divided into two components, the functional matrix and the skeletal unit. The totality of the soft tissues associated with a single function is termed as the functional matrix. There are two distinct types of functional matrices, the periosteal matrix and the capsular matrix. Periosteal matrix influences the bone directly through the periosteum. All periosteal matrices act by the process of bone deposition and resorption. Examples for periosteal matrices are temporalis muscle, teeth, blood vessels, nerves, and glands. Periosteal matrices form the local environmental factors which affect the growth. The influence of periosteal matrix is restricted to part of the bone, affecting the microskeletal unit. Capsular matrix includes the capsule that surrounds masses and spaces. For example, the neural mass is contained within the capsule of scalp and dura mater. Orbital mass is surrounded by the supporting tissues of eye. The oronasal pharyngeal spaces are surrounded by a variety of tissues that form their capsule. Neurocranial capsular matrix is formed by the brain, leptomeninges, and cerebrospinal fluid. Orofacial capsular matrix pertains to functioning spaces and tissues in respiration and deglutition. Capsular matrix forms the local epigenetic factor, which controls growth. There is genetically determined volumetric expansion of the capsular matrix. Volumetric expansion of the capsular matrix causes spatial translation of the whole bone, or macroskeletal unit. Capsular matrix causes growth of the whole bone. The totality of all the skeletal tissues associated with one function is called a skeletal unit. There are two types of skeletal units, microskeletal and macroskeletal. Microskeletal unit includes parts of the bone. It is affected by periosteal matrix. This causes transformation of the bone, which leads to change in size and shape of the bone. The macroskeletal unit includes the core of the bone. It is affected by capsular matrix. This causes translation of bone, which leads to change in position of the bone. Both the process of transformation and translation together leads to growth.